Je m'appelle Ella, je suis un membre original de Jeunes de Chelsea. My name is Ella Lake, and I am a co-founder and organizer for Chelsea Youth. Thank you so much for coming. I'm amazed by the amount of people here. This is Chelsea's first event, so thank you for your support. Chelsea Youth started up around March this year, and the first meeting was dedicated to defining our purposes and goals. Jeunes de Chelsea a trois buts fondamentaux: d'impliquer les jeunes dans la politique locale et les enjeux qui les affectent, d'encourager l'implication de la communauté dans les décisions municipales en aidant avec la propagation de l'information et en commençant des discussions, et finalement d'amplifier les voix sur l'action environnementale. We ended up with three main points. The first is to involve youth in an interesting and dynamic way in local politics and other issues that affect them. The second is to involve the general community, you guys, more by increasing the levels of transparency in municipal affairs and sparking discussions around communal action and solidarity. Finally, we want to encourage speaking up for climate and climate action within our society and all levels of government. From these ideas, this panel was born, and we hope you are as excited as we are for tonight's discussion. We wanted to make this as bilingual as possible, on voulait rendre ce soir aussi bilingue possible. But as it is a discussion and not scripted, we won't be stopping to translate everything that is said. Comme c'est une discussion, nous n'allons pas arrêter pour traduire. Par contre, si quelqu'un n'a pas compris quelque chose, je vous invite à venir nous demander après. Sophia Sidaris, our sixth panelist, had to cancel last minute as she had to speak at another event in Vancouver today. But she has provided us with her answers to some of our pre-prepared questions, so I will be reading those for her. Sophia Sidaris, finalement, n'a pas pu être ici ce soir, alors je vais lire ses réponses pour elle. Also, Elizabeth Lowe here has to leave at 7:45, Yeah. But our discussion will continue, so please don't leave with her. Wayne Murray is our moderator this evening, so let's go.
So each panelist has up to 3 minutes to give their preliminary answer, though they aren't obliged to answer every question. And then the discussion can continue for up to 8 minutes. We've got a lot to cover tonight. On a beaucoup à voir ce soir. So we now invite each panelist to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Mia Bayer. I'm a 16-year-old social and climate justice activist. I've been taking part in social and climate justice movement since I was 5 as part of our education. I'm homeschooled, so I could take days off and go to protest against the government. I'm also the founder of Future Rising Ottawa. We started striking in front of Parliament in January. I think we're up to 40 weeks of striking. I think that's how many weeks. And we've also, I myself have taken part in several different social events like this one.
My name is Stephen Woodley, and I wish I was 16. I'm a biologist.
To be perfectly honest.
I'm a biologist, and I work in nature conservation. Currently, I work for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature.
Hi, my name is Aaron Thornell. I am the acting general manager for the Ottawa Renewable Energy Cooperative, as well as its sister co-op, Co-Energy. We develop community-scale, community-owned renewable energy projects, energy efficiency projects, and all different kinds of stuff. So happy to be here. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Mark Rosen. My company in Ottawa is called Building Energy Inc. And I am a residential sustainability consultant and a building scientist. And that means that I get to help builders and homeowners try to make their homes more efficient as possible, and help them comply with changing building codes, requirements of voluntary programs like Energy Star for New Homes, Passive House, R2000, some of these names that you may have heard come across. My background is architecture, that's what I went to school for, and I moved into the world of residential sustainability about 10 years ago. And I'm a board member on the Canadian Association of Consulting Energy Advisors, which is an association that is nationally trying to raise the professionalism of what we do as consultants to the home sustainability sector. And I'm very happy to be part of this panel tonight. Thanks for having me.
Good evening. My name is Elizabeth Logue. I am the Ottawa Riverkeeper with Ottawa Riverkeeper Organization. I'm also Algonquin Irish from this territory, so as my elders have taught me, I welcome you to traditional Algonquin and ceded territory. So I've been almost 2 months on the job, but my background is in policy, Indigenous policy. And so I'm 2 months on the job with Ottawa Riverkeeper, but that passion for the watershed and for community is what drove me to want to become the Ottawa Riverkeeper. And so I'm here tonight just really energized with all of the people here to talk about the climate change crisis. I can say that my daughter is inspired by all of you, and at Wakefield School now, on every Friday, she's in grade 5, and she has a climate strike march around the schoolyard, and she says she's got the K4s, the kindergarten and 4-year-olds involved as well. So Chini Gwech for that. Thank you.
Thank you. So we will now begin with our first question. So, in Canada, we have severe issues with Indigenous rights and Indigenous land rights. And even though a lot of the offenses have been committed and have occurred on a federal level and can only be corrected on a federal level, what are the steps that small communities can take towards reconciliation?
So I have Sophia Sagaris' answer. We are at a crucial time where Indigenous rights and climate change intersect at the most important intersection, pipelines. Countless Indigenous communities are on the front lines protecting Mother Earth and all living beings. Our culture is directly connected to the land, therefore violating our land rights and entitlement to consent on extractive engagements on our lands is a direct violation of our cultural rights. This is so important to understand when talking and understanding government, especially the new trend our Prime Minister calls reconciliation. This concept surrounds the nation-to-nation relationship Trudeau promised Indigenous peoples and calls to action put in place by his government to address Indigenous issues. However, he sends militarized police to the Unistad in BC because the Gitsan people of the Frog Clan did not consent to the LNG pipeline being forced. Reconciliation and climate change, therefore, are directly connected, and in order to solve one must solve the other. You cannot have meaningful climate discussions without Indigenous peoples not only at the table, but making decisions about the land they have occupied before this land was called Canada and was stolen. Non-Indigenous peoples have a special role to play in making sure that Indigenous peoples are being heard and in positions of power in the system on behalf of themselves and their lands.
I'll start, but I do want to hear from other panelists, obviously. So in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission tabled 94 calls to action, and I would actually argue that those calls to action are for all Canadians. So when I hear that question framed as the federal government's role, I think that, and we're here tonight talking about the role of small communities, that really, there might be called small communities, but we're big people. We're, that kind of sense of, as individuals, I think that we have a role to play in sort of driving home the idea that reconciliation belongs to all of us. When it comes to resource-based development and decisions being made about the land and about the watershed where we all live, and those decisions are, being made by the powers that be, as we say. I think that there's a role for communities to speak out and to sort of get behind Indigenous nations who are pushing up against that resource development. There's a lot to be learned, as we've heard from traditional knowledge, but even just Indigenous knowledge today on building codes, even on how the land should be used in a sustainable manner. And I think once start listening more, I think that sustainability will go a long way towards this idea of how do we address the climate crisis.
I'm going to keep coming back all night to the connection between nature and the climate crisis, because they're really interrelated things. We have a dramatic biodiversity crisis globally and even locally, and the solution to that actually is to protect more nature, because most of the problems are driven by habitat loss. And there is a huge movement already in this country to protect a whole lot more of the country. You heard during the election, 3 parties say they were going to protect 30% by 2030, and that will not be done without the full partnership and really leadership and traditional knowledge of First Nations. It has to be, and I think all the parties involved in this exercise get that. In terms just bringing it locally, we have Gatineau Park, and Gatineau Park has a governance problem because it doesn't really have an act to manage it, and I think there's an opportunity to work with the local First Nations to manage Gatineau Park under a whole new governance paradigm.
Yeah, I would just add, I think it probably goes maybe without saying in this community, but certainly in other small communities, I think there's roles, in particular majority settler communities. The role of self-education is really one that can't be overlooked, one that we all need to take on, or all settler folk need to take on. And whether that looks like Indigenous book clubs. I know there's one that Pam, the activist Pam Palmer has started recently, so something like that can be as simple as bringing together friends or family and sharing ideas about Indigenous works of fiction, non-fiction, and just really taking the impetus upon oneself to educate. So that's what I would add.
Thank you. I believe we're ready to move on to our next question. Oh, okay, perfect. Sorry.
So I just wanted to add to what everyone was saying, that it is our democratic right to protest, and it is our democratic responsibility. So when you see an injustice in our society or in our political system, it is your responsibility to take to the streets. Your democratic role and pressure to the governments does not end at the ballot box, that's where it starts. So when you vote for a certain party and then another party gets in or that party gets in, you have to continue to pressure them no matter what. We've been signing petitions and sending emails and making calls for decades, and we've just dug ourselves in a deeper hole. And so it's time to take serious action, and Indigenous communities have been taking serious action for decades, and it's time that we rally behind them and we learn from them and we amplify their voices however we can. So,
Bravo. So our second question is, our rivers and lakes have such an importance in our daily lives, and recently there have been several conflicts around the federal government failing to take responsibility and protect these precious resources. What are things communities can do to conserve and protect waterways as much as possible?
Well, the Ottawa River keeps going. Well, yes, definitely. As part of our mandate, we are pushing to have a swimmable, drinkable, what's her name again? See, it's been 2 months. But essentially, I think engaging with the river, knowing your river, being curious about what's happening on the watershed. This Ottawa River watershed is over 1,200 kilometers, and it starts just south of Val-d'Or and goes to Niskanen all the way to Oka. And when I tell people that you know how big this watershed is, it's the size of France or the size of Europe. That just getting to know your watershed is a big part of being able to advocate for it. So you know we do activities like shoreline cleanups. And recently in the Papineau area, they pulled out like 400 tires, you know, in a weekend. So it's stuff like that where you may not know it's there, and then until you actually engage with the water and know what's going on. So I would say there's that side of it. There's being curious about. I have to say, before coming here today, I went on the Chelsea municipal website just to see, okay, where is wastewater going? What's going on with the wastewater? What's the wastewater management? And on the website, the last report is from 2017. It's supposed to be an annual report on what they do with wastewater. So things like that, being curious and finding out what's going on in your watershed is a big part of that, and then being able to advocate. So I guess I would say that trying not to wait for those crisis moments where you do need to take to the street to you know advocate on behalf of the watershed. Up in Wakefield area where I'm from, you know, we had different protests with regard to the watershed where you know if it comes to a point where they're actually going to already be building something and there's going to be a detrimental effect on the watershed. So trying to stay on top of those things and getting ahead of those issues is what I would say.
I have to profess that I'm out of my depth on the first couple of questions, but I'm going to take a stab at this one from a personal experience that I've had that relates to infrastructure and water in our cities. My wife and I built our own house about 4 years ago, and at the time when we were planning the house, we were aiming for it to be a passive house, very energy efficient home. And we decided to meet with our city councillor to tell him about the project and see if he would get excited and supportive and you know, maybe lend us some words of encouragement. So we explained how it was going to save a lot of energy on heat and a lot of energy on electricity use, and he said, that's great, these are all good things. And then I said, we've also designed the plumbing system to be grey water ready to conserve on our water use. And he said, well, that's unfortunate. And I said, why is that unfortunate? And what he explained to me and what I came to realize was that the city depends on people using water so that they pay on their bill, so that the municipality has some source of revenue for infrastructure replacement and upgrading. And so failing infrastructure was being replaced only by using more of what we were trying to rebuild the infrastructure to deal with in the first place. And it just exposed this very strange way that the funding of this resource management was being done on the backs of people who were not incentivized to conserve in the first place. And that was eye-opening to me. So just wanted to share that aspect on the infrastructure municipal water use side of things.
Our third question is, what are steps communities can take to ensure that forests and ecologically sensitive areas are protected and conserved? I'd like to thank Joshua for submitting this question. Joshua, thank you.
That one's kind of in my wheelhouse, and I'll go back to my original thing. There's a huge awareness now about the climate crisis, and there's less of an awareness about the biodiversity crisis. But there's an equivalent report on the biodiversity crisis, which I recommend to you. It's called the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And I'll just read you the conclusions. I don't mean to completely depress you, but 75% of the Earth's land surface is significantly altered. Over 85% of the wetlands in the last 2 centuries are gone. 85%. The population size of wild vertebrates since 1970 has gone down 50% globally. So that's a huge biodiversity crisis, and there are about 1 million species at risk, just to add to that list. And it's connected to nature, because connected to climate, because 30% of the climate problem, 30%, is because of green carbon and blue carbon from the oceans that we vaporized into the atmosphere from misusing land and seas. And we can fix a lot of that both with protection and restoration. So if I want to bring it home locally or to small communities, the clear answer is we should be protecting our forests, we should be restoring our forests, we should be protecting our wetlands. Those are really obvious things to do from a climate perspective, and we're doing a lot of them in Chelsea already. There are some good things that have happened. But if we want to keep these ecosystems intact, we also have to keep them connected. We have to keep them ecologically connected. We locally have a responsibility for Gatineau Park, to make sure Gatineau Park stays ecologically connected and is able to plants and animals are able to move in response to climate. So there's a huge connection there. If I just, can I take one more minute on this? If you look at a forest, if you look at the forest outside the door, just on average, there are about 80 tons per hectare tied up in the trees that you see, the limbs above the ground, 80 tons per hectare. In the dead stuff that's on the forest floor, there's about 40 tons per hectare. But all the action's in the soil, all the action's down there where there's 140 tons per hectare. So that's 260 tons in every hectare. And when we convert that to a lawn, we vaporize most of it into the atmosphere. So the more that we can keep, this is really fundamental. The more nature we can keep, the more nature we can restore everywhere. We do a great service for the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis.
I'd like to kind of follow up on that. I think that raises an interesting point that I think is relevant to small municipalities, and that's the discussion of density. And it's a challenging topic in communities that look like Chelsea or Wakefield or similar sized communities all around the country, because often what we see in the construction industry is that density is perceived to be at odds with the culture of small communities like this. It's not in keeping with the typology of the houses or the kind of single family in the greenfield setting that we're used to seeing, that people are very much attached to. But in order to conserve forest land and natural space, we need to occupy the areas where we do live in a more dense way and have more useful space for the populations that occupy them in order to free up space around those developments for nature to be connected across those thresholds. And simply having sprawl, which we are all familiar with, whether it's beautiful homes on beautiful green lots or not, is still too much land use for population density really to be sustainable long term.
Now for our fourth question. What does sustainability mean to you? How do you feel that differs from what is advertised by governments and corporations?
Okay, I'll do it. If you go first, you can make all the mistakes. I mean, this is a huge one. This is the definition to end all definitions. If we knew this for sure, then the conversation would be a lot farther ahead than where it is today. It's an objectively framed thing that I think ends up being much more subjective than we get credit for. And I gave this some thought on the drive up here, because this was one of the questions they gave us some forewarning about. And I tried to put it in context a little bit for myself. Sustainability to me means balance with minimum compromise. And I'll explain what I mean by that as best I can. I think the idea of balance and sustainability is fairly straightforward to understand. If we consume more than we can produce, then we are out of balance and that is not sustainable. That's the basic definition of the word itself. But the need for that balance to come with a minimum of compromise is important in order for whatever the solution is to itself be sustainable for our society, for us as a culture of human beings that have fallacies, that have wants and desires and imperfections, if you will. So with that in mind, I think that anytime we strive for something that achieves balance in residential construction or in conservation or what have you, the solutions that work best are the ones that are perceived by the people involved to be an improvement to the status quo, as opposed to being a restriction on the status quo. And that's a difficult one to manage because we know that we're talking about a crisis. And crisis and compromise sometimes seem like things that you must find a way to reconcile. But I propose that some of the most successful solutions that we've seen to date are actually viewed as improving the quality of life or the enjoyment of life of the people that are involved. And that is to the benefit of the sustainable solution that is put in practice.
People have been arguing about what sustainable development is for a long time. My thesis advisor at university had a big sign up on his door that said sustainable development, and he wrote ES in full spelling through the sustainable development thing, because it's completely mischaracterized all the time, and you hear the term misused. The UN definition is thus: it's economic development that's conducted without depletion of natural resources. So economic development that's conducted without depletion of natural resources. You often hear it mischaracterized, in my view, as like a three-legged stool that we're trying to balance social, economic, and environmental. Every time we do that, it's a recipe for nature depletion, because you always compromise and you always ratchet down and deplete nature. There are, for those interested, there are a whole bunch of sustainable development goals that we've all agreed to globally, called the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and people have reorganized these into a so-called wedding cake model. And they've taken all the nature conservation ones and put them at the bottom of the wedding cake. They said, you have to have these first. This has to be the basis of the other things that we do, like poverty alleviation and economic development, etc. So I would suggest to you that's a far more robust way to think about this thorny question.
But at the below nature is water. But sustainable, I think sustainable development and sustainability has this creative ambiguity about it that becomes, yes, you can go and get the UN definition. And by the way, it's actually United Nations Day today, which well, we're here meeting on United Nations Day. And we just had a big meeting in New York City on climate. And yet, you know, we can find these definitions, as you say, like finding that balance, but then having the argument that the balance actually brings imbalance. You're always going to have to give something up for something else. Can you find that model that brings a sustainability? Take what you need and, you know, and don't leave a trace type of thing. So I don't really have a full definition. What does it mean to me? It does mean that that respect for the water and the land comes first, and so learning from that, and then building what you need from there, respecting that, then you will find that sustainability model, and it could mean something different depending on where you stand on the watershed.
Yeah, I would just add a few thoughts, and I think in part of the realm within which I work, when I think of sustainability, a lot of it does dwell on that concept of not the three-legged stool, but how does economic sustainability, what does that look like? And I think when folks maybe hear the phrase talking about what definitions were given by government and corporations, that's associated with growth, constant growth model. And I think there's been a lot of thinking and amazing work put out that shows that a constant economic growth model is by definition not sustainable. And so I think part of the way I think about sustainability is how do we shift our mindsets towards something along the lines of a steady state economic system or even a degrowth system, and how do we incorporate circular economies into our daily lives and make those more accessible to people. So how do we make things that are potentially only accessible by the sort of wealthier socioeconomic classes accessible to all? And how does that fit in with our resource use and our resource and returning resources to the earth as well?
Our next question is, what should education on the climate crisis include in schools?
So I've been homeschooled my entire life. I have not spent a single second in any kind of educational institution ever. So I can't really speak to this on a personal level, but just having conversations with friends who do go to school or have gone to school, I honestly think we can't really have a conversation about the climate crisis in any kind of educational forum in schools at the moment, because the standardized education is organized by the governments, it's created by the governments, and they're the ones who are feeding the corporations who are killing our planet. So you can't really, we're not set up to have a conversation about the climate crisis in schools at the moment. There would have to be a complete societal shift and a social shift in order for there to be a just and true conversation about the climate crisis. There would always be some details that wouldn't be spoken about, or you can't necessarily go in depth about certain subjects because of the governments and the corporations' pockets. And so at the moment, we can't really have one.
I agree. However, I would disagree that I would propose at least that the alternative is not no conversation, and that even an imperfect conversation is better than a complete kind of willingness to let it fall to the side. What that conversation looks like in the school, I don't know, but I'm going to tackle this actually from a slightly different thing and say that one of the most valuable things we could be emphasizing, and this would be a fundamental shift to the curriculums that do get taught, is encouraging creative problem solving as one of the core fundamental things that we're teaching in schools. And it doesn't have to be specific to a topic related to climate crisis. If we empower people with creative problem solving skills and then expose them to the problems that are out there, I think they're going to be more well equipped to handle solutions that we can't think to teach them. That critical thinking aspect is kind of the most important thing. And yes, there are issues with the way the curriculum is structured to kind of not allow for that development, and that's certainly an issue that needs some examination. But we can do our best for the time being with kind of a two-pronged approach maybe, and emphasize that in the schools as much as possible.
Full disclosure, I have 2 children in the school system in Wakefield, and we just got through a federal election, right? And my daughter was in grade 5. They did do a whole session on the election, electoral process, democracy, and then they did a vote, and the Greens won in Wakefield. I heard in Chelsea it may have been split, but in Wakefield, at the Wakefield School, the Greens won it. And, there's that. There's that kind of bringing that. I guess I come back to engaging with nature, with the watershed, where if we can incorporate that into the curriculum of schools, if we can demonstrate that beauty, that love for nature and the watershed, that's going to be carried along into decision making, into creative problem solving, that it cannot be denied. So can we infuse it into the curriculum? Then that takes strong voices from parents, strong voices onto school boards, which I've been there before and I've lost, but I would do it again. So I think that there's hope in that regard. So that's why I'm like, have hope. That there, you got to cut through there's hypocrisy, and there is that needs to be cut through, and I think our kids show us that hypocrisy too. So it's, I think that gives some strength to the argument that we need voices to change the curriculum.
So there was a paper published in a scientific journal yesterday, which actually tracked the amount of interference in public education that was being done by big oil, which is rather remarkable. And they were able to document this through going back through social media. And this has been subject to books and investigative journalism, et cetera, et cetera. And it's been shocking, frankly. So I think our education system, not only in schools, but our collective education system is being really twisted by this. It's way more than the cover-up that went on with smoking. It's a major global crisis, and people are doing it to keep their own economic interests alive. And this is a dramatic crisis for our planet because we have a huge problem, and it's being subverted by those interests, and we have to watch out for that, all of us, and make ourselves aware of that, I think.
Our sixth question is, do you think small communities can have a meaningful impact on the climate crisis?
Who's going to say no?
Yes. I think so. I think one of the really exciting things about small municipalities, when you compare them to the larger municipality, city metropolises that we have, is that they're more nimble. They can move more quickly and with a unified voice more easily. Sometimes trying to get the bigger cities and the provincial level and the federal level is, the boat keeps getting bigger. It's a lot harder to steer. It's a lot harder to make a change of course. And municipalities on a small scale can be a little bit more quick on their feet and can lead by example in that respect and show some of the bigger entities what's possible on a small scale first before you try and expand that model. I also have to say that you guys are the most generous crowd here.
So someone last night sent me a report, which was very kind of them, about how big a role municipal governments had in Canada, and this was done by the Canadian Federation of Municipalities, and they said that municipal governments currently have direct or indirect control over 44% of greenhouse gases emissions in Canada. So it appears that that may be an overestimate, I'm not sure, but it appears that at the municipal level there are enormous amounts of things that can be done to deal with this issue. That report's online.
Yeah, I would just echo what Mark was saying about the sort of nimbleness. My organizations work largely in the city of Ottawa, but not exclusively, and with that, we've never managed to even scrape the surface of a palpable kind of project with the city of Ottawa, largely because of the glacial pace at which that entity moves at times. We have fortunately managed to work with like a small municipality like Alfred Plantagenet out east of Ottawa, and that just I think is a demonstration of what Mark was mentioning. Furthermore, I would think that, and this is coming from my experience, I went to university in a small town in Nova Scotia, Antigonish, and what I saw there was a real ability for the general public, community groups to come together and, as Mark said, is speaking in a unified voice and reach their elected representatives. So I think there's far less of a gap between the decision makers, and not only the decision, your councillors or your MPPs or things like this, but also with the actual bureaucrats and people that carry out the work. Because those are the folks who need to hear about concerns as well. Those are the folks who actually do the work to get things done. So I would say that's a real goal and a real advantage, I would say, that small communities have in this crisis.
Yeah, I strongly believe in small community voice, the ripple effect, really. What I see, as you say, is nimble, but it's that ripple effect of banning plastic bags, all of these small acts that can actually grow and have a ripple effect into the larger municipalities. Again, showing them that it can be done, that it's not impossible. I think that that's where small communities have that strength.
Sorry, can I share one more story?
Yes, of course, sir.
Just wanted to give a bit of an example from the construction industry that I thought was interesting. There's I won't give any company names, but there was a company that I came across recently that was creating pre-manufactured, structurally insulated wall panels for housing. This is a way of partially prefabricating housing so that it can be built to a higher quality more quickly and achieve a better thermal envelope. A SIP panel, a structurally insulated panel, is factory assembled and is meant to arrive on site, be dropped in place, and be finished. And that's how it works. That's the intention of this. The company that was working on the project with me, I was a consultant on this project. It was in Ottawa and therefore was subject to the building inspection department of Ottawa. And this was the first time that these SIP panel manufacturers had been required to house wrap their panels, which was not necessary with the way their panels were designed. In every other small municipality in Ontario where they installed their product, the department that was involved in inspections had come on board and learned about what their product was and approved it for its innovation in the way it was meant to be used. And when they got to the larger municipality of Ottawa, they met that resistance, that kind of glacial pace of adopting new innovation. And it really highlighted that idea that, that small towns can pivot. If something new comes along, it's exciting, it's worth pursuing. They can say, yes, we're willing to try this much more easily than a bigger municipality can.
Our next question is in French, so for the panelists, the English translation is on the table, and for the audience, the English translation is up on the screen. Avez-vous des exemples de petites municipalités au Québec où le conseil municipal est très engagé au niveau de ses politiques et surtout de ses actions en matière d'environnement?
Je peux répondre un petit peu en français? OK. Récemment, quand j'ai commencé à Gare-Rivière, on a travaillé avec les municipalités de Papineau, Grenville, Russell, et puis il y en a une troisième, mais on fait un pacte de l'amitié. So these three municipalities, one on the Ontario side and two on the Quebec side, signed a friendship pact. And they had done this years ago, and they had built a bike path that went, through all three municipalities or NRCs. And this time around, in September, they signed a pacte de l'amitié to protect the watershed, so the river. So shoreline cleanups, water testing, and we worked with them on this. But I think that that kind of I guess it gets to another aspect that we haven't really touched on, but that sort of idea that the climate crisis doesn't know political boundaries. The climate crisis doesn't know jurisdictional codes or different legislation as it passes through our lungs. It's about that interjurisdictional people working together across those lines to protect our natural environment. I think is a big step. But it needs to grow. I mean, we've been trying for years to have a watershed council, which would include federal, Quebec, and Ontario, and that's been a big challenge. And so, we're not going to stop pushing, but that's where smaller communities, I see that sort of feeling of grassroots demonstrating once again how it can be done and then growing from there. So that's an example of different municipalities coming together for the watershed, so one aspect of the climate crisis. So it's a bilingual answer. Je ne vais pas répondre à tout en français, mais je peux si vous voulez.
J'ai un exemple. Je ne suis pas certain, mais je crois qu'il y a 10 municipalités au Québec qui a déclaré une crise climatique.
Our eighth question is, do you think that within small communities, it is more the responsibility of businesses to lead on environmental action or the municipality?
Well, I think my initial reaction to that question is that, for the most part anyway, businesses will do what their customers ask of them. I would say that by virtue of this, by virtue of businesses taking the lead, that would precipitate, or that would require that their consumers, their customers, urge them to take the lead, by the same virtue as municipalities. So I think it requires a joint effort. I would say one is more important than the other, because ultimately when we're looking at a major portion of the climate crisis, which is carbon emissions, they don't really discriminate based on who is the emitter. It's all the same when it comes to the effect that it's having on our planet. So I guess I didn't really think of this, my answer, before I picked the microphone.
I'll swoop in then. This is an interesting question. I thought of this as I was thinking about this one. I ended up thinking a little bit more about the differences in how I could see this functioning between a small municipality and a big municipality. In a small municipality, because of the kind of closeness to between the population and the governing bodies, I think that municipality can play a bigger role. Municipality can take direction and push their community and the businesses that are part of that community in the direction that everyone thinks we need to go. There's not always, unanimous consensus, but sometimes you can take a bit of a risk and say, well, this is what our small community stands for, and push on that, and businesses that are on board will thrive, and businesses that aren't, perhaps are not the businesses that need to stick around anyways. So I think that in small communities, municipalities have a bit more of a push role. They can play a little bit more of an influence role. Whereas in large communities, I think their role is primarily to try and get out of the way of businesses that are innovating, and to stop being a barrier to success rather than trying to be a one-stop solution by pushing too much. I think there's more variety in voices and impact in a large city that makes it more difficult for municipality to pick a direction that satisfies everyone. So I think it's more, it behooves them more to try to step aside when innovation comes along and enable it to happen. In small communities, just because of the virtue of being smaller, there might not be as frequent or as diverse the opportunity for innovation, and I think municipalities can step in and try and fill that void with some action from their end.
Now on to our next question. What do you think the responsibilities of developers are in the climate crisis?
Déjame buenas maderas. Developers get singled out in a way that I don't think I shouldn't say that they don't deserve. They do deserve to get singled out a lot of the time. But they're not alone here, and they face a very unique challenge, I think. In sustainable residential construction especially, the two people that are spoken about the most in terms of what's needed to achieve sustainability goals are the home buyers and the builders. The buyers need to be more educated and ask the right questions. The builders need to provide solutions and make homes more sustainable and more affordable. And that puts builders and developers in a very tough spot because aside from the sustainability issue and the climate crisis that we're facing, we're also facing a housing affordability crisis, which is very, very difficult to reconcile with the need to build more sustainable housing. In our current economic situation in Canada and in Ontario, more sustainable houses cost more to build. There has not been a leap in innovation in this field that has solved that problem yet. So if we accept that to be true in our current moment, then the question is how can we make it possible in more creative ways for people who are looking to buy sustainable homes to have easier access to financing to do so. And when you start to look at that question in that way, you realize that looking at only the builders and the homeowners is too narrow a focus. We need to be including the banks, the appraisers, the insurance companies, the people that are selling these homes, the realtors, the municipalities that are setting zoning rules for these homes and all these sorts of things. And we need to get creative with the solutions that are available to people to make the good choice when they're choosing which developer to buy from. If they see that builder X and builder Y are building substantially different products, and builder Y is doing the sustainable thing but costs $20,000 more as a starting price, a buyer needs to have access to that $20,000 which they can recover through energy savings over the long term, month-to-month costs. There are other ways to come back and solve that issue. But our mortgage rules and our insurance rules are too constrained in that respect to allow us to have any creative flexibility on the building front.
I'm not a developer, but I mean, I was mentioning earlier that there is a large housing development going in Wakefield, and there's already started this Facebook page about it, and everyone's getting involved. So I think when I think of the responsibilities, I think that idea of, like what you just talked about, there's definitely, you need to be informed and educated, and everybody needs to be talking to each other. But that transparency, I think, is the big word there, and it's maybe has some creative ambiguity to it too, but at the same time, it's that idea of, okay, let's have a really true discussion about the development and include all the right people. And in a small community, I think you have the opportunity to do that. But you're going to not have everybody shaking their head and applauding after everything you say, and we have to, know that going into, developers should know that going into it and be ready for those creative solution finding that can happen through that dialogue. So that's it.
Our 11th question is, do you think the climate crisis should be the top priority of municipal governments and small communities right now?
Yes.
Everyone we know yes. Yeah.
Short answer, long answer,
Long answer. Yes.
Yes. I say that slowly so it sounds long. No, I think yes, but I think that that what that looks like may be different from municipality to municipality. I like the idea that it is framed as a climate crisis and that municipalities are deciding to declare this so that it can direct their decisions and their policies, hopefully to the good. But the direction that they choose to go first to have maximum impact may not be the same universally. For some municipalities, it may be about sustainable construction and development. For others, it may be about conservation of wetlands or sensitive natural areas. It may be economically based in other situations. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. But the nice thing about simply making that statement is that it incentivizes the participants to act with that as the umbrella that kind of covers every action that you take underneath it.
I guess I would use the improv game term of yes and. Yes and. I think that community members have a role to play in that. In, as you just said, bringing that forward to smaller communities. If as I keep saying that you're our stats guy because you have all the stats. But the 10 municipalities in Quebec, that's not many. Claiming or actually embracing and wanting to do something about the climate crisis. So how do we grow that? How do we get the word out? And how do we engage with those leaders in those communities? And that takes people meeting in churches, people meeting in community centers, and then bringing that forward to municipal council meetings. So that gets on the agenda and then gets acted upon.
At some level, this goes back to who we are as animals. We've evolved as animals to react to threats in different ways. We're really good at reacting to short-term threats. If something is an immediate problem, we deal with it. But this is kind of a medium-term threat, and it's a little bit difficult to deal with. There's lots of information. The best science, the best knowledge we can bring to bear on the planet says we have a problem, and the problem is giant and immediate relatively, and we have to, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we have to be net zero by 2050. Right? Wrap our heads around that. We have to be net zero from carbon. In fact, we should be below net zero by 2050. That's an enormous problem. And the longer we delay, every day we delay significant change, it makes that problem harder because of the curve, because we're backloading the problem. So the longer our municipalities wait, or the longer we wait as individuals, then the problem becomes larger and larger and larger. So the answer to the question is obviously yes, but municipalities are burdened every day by all kinds. They got to pick up the garbage and make sure the water main's fixed and all kinds of real and pressing problems. It's hard to insert this to the front of the queue, but we know we must, and that's why people talk about we can't do business as usual anymore. We've got to do business unusual, and we really do. And this is a giant problem for us personally, and a giant problem for us collectively. But we do. The fact that there's municipalities all around the world declaring a climate crisis is a good thing. The fact that Greta Thunberg has mobilized schools to a climate strike is a wonderful thing. I think we're on a tipping point. This is good news. We're kind of on a collective psyche tipping point. But start your engines. We really have to make this our number one problem.
I would add that I couldn't agree more. The scale of what has to be done from a municipal standpoint all the way up, or from an individual all the way up to a federal government standpoint or point of view is remarkable. I was just talking to my friend who works with the City of Ottawa, and she's working on the climate change task force, if you will. Essentially, that's what they're looking at, and they're looking at what the municipality of Ottawa needs to do to tackle this. And just looking at the transportation sector alone, there needs to be, I believe it's about $7.5 billion of investment over the next 10 years in the public transport system in Ottawa to even sort of get close to that net zero target of 2050. So it really can't be understated. But I think one thing that helps, I was all for the Declaration of Climate Emergency. I was a part of the group that helped get that sort of momentum driven in Ottawa, but I think we need to take it a step further. and again, I'm going to reference Ottawa just because that's the context that I know well. Right now, we're in a process, the official plan, Ottawa's official plan, which is essentially the development and land roadmap for the next 20 years is being created. And you know, when you think of that, 20 years we could be past the point of no return by the end of that. So these kinds of documents, these kinds of these roadmaps are really essential for the general public to really press our decision makers, and as I come back to our bureaucrats, to be able to just really emphasize how much of a top priority that is, because as was mentioned, there's competing priorities day in, day out for these kinds of plans to be putting the climate crisis at the very top. One of the ways that I have come to think about a lot, because of some of the organizing work that I've been doing outside of my day job, is around the Green New Deal, which I feel like a lot of folks are probably familiar with. I think it's a powerful, whether you call it that or not, it's a powerful idea, and it's inspiring, I think, a lot of folks around the world. And I think when we take that, if we allow that to be our paradigm that we look through everything with, if we look through, as I like that wedding cake analogy, if we look through everything with climate and the watershed as the core, the fundamental base of everything we do, then we might start being able to address all the other things that need to be addressed on a day-to-day, a month-to-month, a year-by-year basis, but it needs to be looking through that lens of climate. So in that respect, I think that's where municipalities have to, agree completely that it needs to be a top priority, and that's how I think they can make it that, is by using that as a lens to frame their conversations, their debates, their budgets.
I think one of the things that's interesting about the tipping point that we feel like we're on at the moment is that it's no longer a question of how do we do this from a technical perspective. It's how do we implement this? How do we transition to this? The question of building sustainable houses and having sustainable transportation and providing food in a sustainable way, we understand what the solutions need to look like. And we can build a passive house and a net zero house, and we can build a good electric car, we can build a charging infrastructure. We don't know how to transition to that. We don't know how to pay for that. We don't know how to minimize the suffering that will come from job losses or transitions that families have to deal with, repositioning of people. So the question of implementation is something that municipalities arguably have potential to influence in a meaningful way, because they're not tasked with figuring out how to build a net zero house. They're tasked with finding mechanisms that will empower and enable people to build net zero houses. And that's true of whatever the solution is that you're talking about, conservation. So it's an interesting one. I think people are recognizing now and are starting to say, okay, I see this in the construction world a lot. The question no longer is how do I build a net zero home? The question is how do I build a net zero home affordably? Or how do I build a net zero home quickly? Or how do I build it to a high quality? We know how to do it. We have to figure out how to do it on a much, much larger scale than what we're doing right now. What did I do?
That was a long answer. Except when I look at the question again, I think, well, do I think right now? No. Actually, I think 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Because I actually, before coming here, I saw an image online of the Ile de la Madeleine that is eroding. The island is, the road along the coast has fallen into the water. So how, part of me goes like, how is it, if they had implemented a climate crisis now plan yesterday, would it have helped? 10 years ago, would it have helped? How do we really get, as you say, this tipping point to go far enough to help in a meaningful way to reverse or at least slow things down to get us to where we need to go?
Our next question is, what can municipalities do to make renewable energy accessible?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that municipalities can do. I think as Mark has been mentioning, municipalities often hold the levers, so to speak, the sort of macro levers that help businesses or individuals or homeowners or associations, community groups, enact these kinds of solutions that we need to see. I would say that in terms of making renewable energy accessible, I think, as Mark said again, the technology is there, and it's getting better every day, every month, every year. But in terms of accessibility, still, cost is a big factor. I think there is a big role. Municipalities have, I'll speak to the Ontario context just because I know it a little bit better. Municipalities have a little less control over the sort of macro electric sort of grid that's very much in the realm of the province, but I think municipalities still need to lead by example in those fields. So again, I'll use the example of Ottawa. In the failure, they did not really take advantage of a program that was designed really to benefit like municipalities like Ottawa and all other municipalities around the province. So when there was the Green Energy Act in Ontario, there was a procurement program for renewable energy projects. And the municipality of Ottawa secured 20 of these contracts, I believe, at the sort of outset of this program, and only managed to build 8 of them. These are solar projects for the most part. And that just sort of highlighted, I think that kind of lack of follow-through by a municipality like that shows a lack of willingness to make renewable energy accessible for its constituents. One of the things that our organization tries to do is rectify that in some ways. So, as I mentioned during the introduction, we develop these community-owned renewable energy projects. So we really try to drive home the fact that folks can get involved in the renewable energy transition, even if they're not putting solar panels on their own roof, because as I mentioned, that's not something that many folks can afford. So one of the things that we try to do is we develop these projects, and then all of them are owned and financed through our membership. So our cooperative is made up of about 750 members, and all 21 of our projects are owned or co-owned by those 750 individuals. So these are folks who are putting their investment dollars to work in their own community towards the renewable energy transition. And so that's one of the things that I think it's not something a municipality is doing, but it's something a community group within a municipality is being able to make work. And we really try to borrow from that sort of, we try to counteract, I guess, that not in my backyard sentiment that's so often associated with renewable energy projects, not so much with solar, which is what we do, but a lot obviously with wind and stuff. And while there's legitimate, I think, excuses from an ecological point of view, and there needs to be really scrupulous, there needs to be the proper due diligence done when developing these kinds of projects. I would say that to counteract this sort of not in my backyard sentiment, it really requires folks to have a stake in those projects. So that's what we try to do is develop projects that people have put their investment dollars towards, and I think that goes a long way towards making renewable energy, not just renewable energy, but making folks believe that a transition towards renewable energy is possible because they see these projects being developed like on their school buildings or in their communities and things like that. So.
I think that's just a phenomenal example of an alternative financing solution to a problem that we're facing, and I really not to commend the work that you guys are doing on that. And it's the type of thing that if a municipality becomes aware of, they could do a lot to facilitate or encourage by really saying, look, here's local dollars going to improve things in the community. We can push things towards companies that are doing work like this. Another thing that I wanted to mention, and I don't know if any of the panelists might know more about this than I do. I just heard about this idea on Monday, and I have not looked into it much. But I was in a workshop on Monday, and somebody mentioned PACE financing. Have you heard about this? Okay, so you can fill it out in a little bit more, but this is a way for municipalities to allow people to make energy efficiency or other upgrades to their properties and pay for it through their property taxes over time, rather than putting it on their home equity line of credit or on their mortgage. And since you seem to know a bit more, maybe you can explain some of the nuances, but it seems like something that is within the municipality's grasp.
Yeah, I think it's, so this is a program that is implemented in Toronto, because in the province of, and I don't know what it is in Quebec, but in the province of Ontario, municipalities don't always have control over their building codes and things like this. But because Toronto is such a huge municipality, basically a province unto itself, it has got that permission to be able to implement the PACE program. I can't property assess something. But yeah, basically what it seeks to get around is the problem that's faced a lot in, probably more common in larger municipalities, but I'm sure it's experienced in smaller municipalities as well, that the average homeowner, this is that, I think that's Ontario-wide, is only in their home for about 7 years. So when folks are thinking about putting in, an air source heat pump, or putting solar panels on their roof, or any of these other, really innovative energy efficiency solutions to their own home, their own property, they're not going to see that financial payback in the time that they are living in that home. Because some of these payback measures, depending on the measure, of course, some of these measures have, a 10-year, 15, 20-year payback. If you're talking about building envelope, right, it gets quite up there, especially if you're talking about retrofitting an existing home. So the PACE program really seeks to get around that by allowing you to implement these changes, and then when you move out, that's okay, because you're essentially the property tax. The payment is coming through the payment of the property tax, so the next homeowner is taking on those costs. And yeah, really innovative.
Yeah, what I really like about that as an idea is that, number one, it defers a lot of your costs to a point in the future when energy prices hopefully will have risen. I know that's not a popular thing to say in some rooms. But as energy costs go up, energy savings that you see also go up, and then the ability to offset your increased property taxes with those savings makes economic sense. And I really like that aspect. The other thing that I really like about this is as a kind of creative financing solution that's within the power of municipalities to work with, is it addresses the existing housing stock, which is the big elephant in the room. Often when we're talking about sustainable development, we're talking about new construction and the new houses that are being built. Our building code is arguably one of the best in the world, and even code-built houses are substantially more energy efficient than most of the existing building stock. And if we look at the percentage of houses that are going to be in existence in 2030 when we're supposed to be net zero, the stat is something like 90% of those homes are already built. They already exist. So if we only depend on codes and new housing to solve the problem by going to net zero, we haven't addressed the bulk of the energy consumption that we're dealing with. And programs like this that can help to incentivize people to make improvements to their existing home without the penalty of not being able to recoup it on resale or not having the cash up front, I think are necessary.
Moving on to our 14th question. How can rural communities encourage availability of energy efficient services like public transportation? Thank you to Barb for your question.
I'm a biology guy, I don't know anything about but I do want to give a shout out to our municipality, because I think that the mayor and council have worked hard to get to upgrade municipal or public transportation in our community. Obviously, we have to do a massive change, but we have to take it too. That's the point. We just can't, we gotta stop all driving our cars and take transportation or find alternative ways to go with low carbon transportation on our bikes or electric cars or whatever. We gotta stop burning gas. We know that. We're at a bit of a challenge in terms of density to do really truly creative things like car sharing that are really done commonly in cities now. But I think we could do that in neighborhoods. I think we could cooperate with some incentives, cooperate on sharing. Like why couldn't the top of one of the roads up in the hills share 2 or 3 electric cars as houses collectively? We have to think about doing these kinds of things differently if we're going to do it. We know as a community, we're a wealthy community by Canadian standards. Our mean income is way up there. Our level of education is way up there. We should be able to be truly leaders in this kind of exercise, not laggards.
I would just sort of build on that, especially with sort of the e-cars and having, I know in Wakefield there's a plug at the community center, and then there's a plug that somebody can find, at the mill and maybe secretly think, pretend that they're staying at the hotel and plug in their car and try to charge it there. So definitely I think in rural communities having more spots to plug in for transportation. And I do know of one family in Wakefield that have just bought one car where they actually use, anyway, I think they have like a 40-minute drive in, and it's just enough to plug it in again. They just get to work. Then they plug it in for the day, and then they drive back home, and they just get up the driveway. But that's sort of, telling that story, I think, more and more, and letting the municipality know that those are needed, I think it is one thing. Again, it's having that voice and telling the decision makers that it's desired. But definitely, there's smaller actions that municipalities can take, even on, like you say, on their buildings. Like retrofitting buildings, so that it is an incentive or it inspires others to do that. I know that, even at the Wakefield School, the lights are on all night and it's a safety measure, but the kids and residents are going, well, is there another way? So just finding those creative solutions, and I think the rural communities should be doing that and encouraging that, and for public transportation. I mean, it takes individuals to spearhead those things, and we see it on social media. Not everybody's on social media, but we see it on Facebook pages and social media to say, I'm driving in, who needs a ride? And it's happening more and more and more in rural communities, which is great. It is sort of like the bulletin board. People go there to find out whether or not they can get a ride in at 10 o'clock and when can they get back. And they change their day around that. And they're willing to. And that's great. But, do our municipal councillors know that they're doing that? I'm not sure. So it's how do we get them involved in giving more incentives? I think that's where we're at.
Finally, our 15th question is, there is so much advertisement about what actions individuals can take to have an impact, such as biking to work, using less electricity, switching to a plant-based diet, etc. But there isn't a lot of widely circulated information on what community actions can be taken to have a bigger impact. What do you think are examples of these potential actions?
Who knows we have a sustainable development plan in Chelsea? Who has read the sustainable development plan? Okay, well, shame on you, you should all read it. So we have one. We have a strategy. Is it commensurate with the scale of the problem? Probably not. But we have an opportunity to kind of dust it off and redo it, because there's a new, the MRC master plan is, I think, finished. Carol, is it finished now? Is it approved? Waiting to hear from Quebec, and we will then follow in behind with our own master plan. So there's a great opportunity for us to take this kind of thinking and put it in place for what we want to do if we really want to become business unusual. So if we know we want to be net zero in terms of carbon emissions by 2050. I would argue that this community should do way better than that, because we have all, if the whole world has to do that, then we've got to be way ahead of the whole world because we have all the resources and capacity to do it. So what's our collective answer? Should we be net zero by 2030? Maybe. Maybe that's a goal that we could set. And if we're going to make this a community goal, we're going to put it in our master plan, then we have to track it. We need to have a carbon tracking system. And that's not outside the realm of the possible. It's something we can do. So we can see where our collective actions through the municipal government, through the provincial and federal governments, and our own individual actions are getting us if we're going to do this. And there's a whole range of things that have to be done, some of which are already in the master plan, or in the sustainable development plan. But we can do better than that, I think, collectively. And that's where municipal governments, I think, can lead through this kind of already existing planning processes. We should have a very carefully monitored system to reduce our greenhouse gases to point X in the future. I'll put out 2030 as a suggestion. We live in an energy-rich, relatively clean, energy-rich environment. We have all the tools in our disposal right here in Quebec right now to do this.
My wife has worked at Shopify, which you may have heard of, and one of the slogans that's plastered all over the walls of their offices is "do things, tell people." And I think that might apply in this context to municipalities taking action as a community to make gigantic leaps forward with policy or planning or action they're taking, but then they should shout it from the mountaintops when they do that to help reap the benefit and to encourage future actions again, and to have more discussion that follows on to it. Simply doing something and then hoping that the results work out is not enough. I think you're spot on with measurement and documenting the impacts of the actions they're taking so that you can tell if they're effective or not is something very important. And then sharing that as much as possible. The more sharing we do, this is a fantastic event for that sort of thing. Kudos to all the organizers. And this is the type of thing that can have huge impacts in municipalities that are small like Chelsea and Wakefield, because I'm sure this is a representative slice of the population in this room. And we're having this conversation, and this will have a ripple effect where everyone here tells other people what's happening. If the municipality can advertise that this happened, tell people what's happening, then the conversation will continue, and it won't just be these candles in the wind that just kind of poof out after they happen.
So we have some time for an open floor, so anyone who'd like to come up and ask a question to our panelists is welcome to. Do we have any volunteers? Come on up.
Can I just ask you from here? I work in the planning department of the glacier known as the City Hall. One thing we're tackling also is emissions and what our plan will be for climate change. Climate emergency was declared back in the spring. In Ottawa, and I think in a lot of municipalities, the bulk of emissions are coming from transportation and buildings. And I expect that's probably true even more so in Chelsea, because we're in Quebec, it's on hydro, and because most of us are driving into town every day for work. And unfortunately, the way that Chelsea is set up in terms of our lots on 1 and 2 acre country estate lots, it means we drive to work, it means we drive our kids to school, it means we drive to the Fresh Mart, we drive to the park, we drive to the pub, whatever. We're driving everywhere. It means transit is incredibly difficult to make run financially and to get ridership up. Chelsea's mostly built out, but I see that same 1 acre, 2 acre model being replicated in Wakefield, everywhere. And the reason for that is because of wastewater and making sure we don't, pollute the aquifers, and we take care of things in terms of water and wastewater. I think one of the best things small municipalities can do is tackle this issue of small-scale wastewater treatment to allow more density for rural development, leave more space to be protected, and also make the provision of infrastructure, of services, make transit an actual possibility. So if you have a 200-acre development, focus all your housing in 40 acres, leave 160 acres for farming or leave it protected. It seems like municipalities are worried about the responsibilities of taking on multiple wastewater or water treatment plants across their municipality, but it seems to me, from a rural perspective, this would be one of the biggest things to creating more compact development that's better from a climate change perspective. Just wondering your thoughts on that.
That's really interesting, and I don't think that I was aware of the aquifer impact and that driving the size of the laws that have to do with development, but it does certainly emphasize the importance of sustainable transportation options. Just by the fact that it's a rural community to begin with, there's inevitably going to be driving that happens. And I think the writing is on the wall for fossil fuels at the end of the day, and so going back to my earlier statement that we kind of know what this solution looks like and have to figure out how to get there, it seems plausible to me to envision everybody driving electric cars that charge from a clean grid that's based on renewable energy. And once we have that, if we live a little bit farther away from the store that we have to go to, we have the opportunity for that commute in and out to be in balance, for us to be offsetting all the energy that we're using for that with something that is sustainably harvested and provided in that respect. I believe, and I hope I'm not off base on that, but I believe that in Quebec, you have one of the cleanest electrical grids of the provinces across the country. Compared to Alberta, for example, you're way ahead of the curve because the electricity that's being generated is substantially better in terms of carbon footprint than other provinces. So that puts you ahead of the game in terms of leaning on something like electric car charging infrastructure, because at least the distribution network is not the worst it could be. Probably not perfect, and there are probably still issues with load management and distribution, etc. But community-scaled renewable generation may be able to offset some of that sort of thing, and potentially, I haven't spoken much to your idea of localized water treatment for the aquifer issue and that sort of thing. But if the solution of public transit is difficult to meet because of the density issue or the population size and it being an economic problem, then we could lean on this other option, which is out there now. And we see auto manufacturers across the world recognizing, even if they're not jumping into both feet yet, they've all at least got one foot in the electric car market because they see that this is just where it's going to go. And if we start getting ready for that with our infrastructure, I think we'll be set up for success there.
I agree. I think that you mentioned earlier the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. I just keep thinking that there's got to be some best practices out there that can be built upon that would fit with this area. I mentioned the development that's going in Wakefield and the sort of, everyone's starting to talk about what are 58 new units going to mean. But the immediate response is, what is it gonna mean to the water, to where is all this wastewater, where are they gonna be taking from the water table? How is that going to work? That's the immediate concern. And then traffic and all of the rest is sort of the transit issues. But I think there must be some best practices out there that can then be adapted to this area. Again, trying to build off of, the character of the area and what is it. So, yeah, I just keep thinking there's got to be some best practices to be built upon.
I think your ideas are spot on, George. And so why aren't they being implemented? And it would be great to hear from Carol, and I see Greg's here. I mean, we have to realize that our municipalities are not, they're not even in the Constitution. They're a product of the provinces. Right? They exist at the pleasure of provincial legislation and have really limited powers. And that's unfortunate and probably something we should fix, because the number of times I've gone, well, let's do it this way, and the answer's been, well, we can't because, and they're all good reasons, but we're in a bit of a bureaucratic straitjacket for what we can and cannot do as a municipality, like individual wastewater treatment plants. We have to break out of that. And I don't want to put Carol or Greg on the spot, but if you want to weigh into this, I would love to hear from you.
Absolutely, and there was a proposed project in Farm Point in the quarry area for an independent wastewater treatment plant, but it requires a certain density. So at this time, density is only allowed within the urban perimeters. So outside the urban perimeter, as you raised a question, there's a lot of resistance from residents. So Stephen, you mentioned that with the approval of the regional master plan, we're hoping to have it by the end of this year. Then we start the revision of Chelsea's master plan, and it's primordial that people get involved and tell us, would you accept a higher density outside the urban core? Because at this point, there's been pushback from residents to not have anything other than the 1 and 2 acre lots, clustering, and which would be required for a wastewater treatment plant. So I'm really hoping that we'll have these conversations through the revision process. We have by law 2 years to adopt the revised master plan. So it will be a very busy year and a half prior to the next election, because it'll need to be adopted before November 2021. I wanted to speak to the best practices, and I think sometimes we're limited by our language barriers, which are unfortunate in Quebec. I'd encourage people to go to a website called PHARE, P-H-A-R-E. It's created by the UMQ, the Union of Municipalities of Quebec, and they're all the best practices for sustainable projects and climate change in municipalities throughout Quebec. And just to mention that Transcanine, our public transit system, is one of those PHARE projects. And it's seen as one of the leading models for a rural public transit, because we don't have a central city. We're, have Gatineau as our main city, but at the south of the MRC. So it's been replicated and talked about in many other regions of Quebec. But I think because of the language barrier, unfortunately, at times we don't go to the Quebec sites and find what is a success and what is best practice in Quebec. And that's not a criticism, it's just to say that that's unfortunately a limitation. But thank you very much to the panelists. Appreciate it.
Maybe a couple of additional observations. Thank you also to the organizers and to the panel. I'm also one of the members of council here in Chelsea. A lot of thought-provoking stuff there. A couple of things that came into my mind is to echo with George's thought. Yes, 80% of our emissions in Chelsea are due to transportation. Part of that is because of how clean our electricity is. But does that mean that we shouldn't be reducing our electricity use? Obviously not. But what does it mean in terms of that? How do we explain that? The way I view it is that any electricity we don't use can offset dirty fuels elsewhere. Does that work through exports from Quebec to Ontario or New York, or whatever? Maybe something that's not of a municipal concern to us, but anything we can do to make more electricity available elsewhere is something we should do. So definitely the building stock, and you're right, the existing building stock is probably our focus. Although we have a lot of new buildings coming up at the moment, those are largely locked in now. I think most of them are quite energy efficient, but our existing stock is not. On the transportation side, where most of our emissions actually are, planning is the #1 thing, and I think George, we're fortunate to have George not only be an expert in Ottawa, but also an expert here in Chelsea, working on our planning commission here. And I think we can do a lot of things in terms of planning. And a lot of it works through densification, which has implications that not everyone is comfortable with. It does involve some trade-offs with some of the things you alluded to earlier about the cultural perceptions of what this municipality has been traditionally, and some change in what that means. But it also, another way of dealing with our transportation emissions, transit is a challenge, as we've talked about, but active transportation. We have amazing opportunities, both internally in terms of promoting active transportation to get to and from the Fresh Mart, and get to the Meredith Center, and get to our village. But we also have, we're not that far away from where people work, that we can't, through maybe some combination of active transportation and transit, and maybe carpooling and a few other things, some creative solutions that can really reduce our transportation emissions. And I think some of the discussion that you've had tonight has generated some thinking on my part. There are some things that we already have underway, but that will, I think, could potentially offer some attractive GHG reduction options. One of the things we do need to do, and this was alluded to in terms of our plan, is we need to know where our emissions are and where the opportunities are. So it starts with the GHG inventory. We don't have that yet, and it's probably the #1 thing we need to do in our plan.
Yeah, just to respond to a couple of things you raised, and some really good points, and just triggered, I don't know if you have to say, I'm going to pass over the mic in a second for you.
So I'll pass it back. I just wanted to say thank you to Miigwech. I do have to go to a board meeting in Wakefield that started 15 minutes ago. But thank you so much. And Naomi is here from the Ottawa Riverkeeper. And she's leading our Youth Water Leaders program and looking into a river school. So she'll be here for a bit. And so if anybody's interested in finding out about Youth Water Leaders and river school, then please chat with Naomi. And thank you so much again. I think this has been wonderful dialogue, just getting going. And
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, so the couple things I want to touch on momentarily that kind of came to mind, was that I think two things. Number one, with master planning and any kind of planning process that happens at a municipal level, one of the challenges that is built into that as a necessary process is inevitably a lack of flexibility. At a certain point, you have to make a decision and go forward with it, and there's consensus, and that makes it sometimes difficult to pivot if there is an opportunity for innovation or something creative comes along. As a small municipality, I imagine that you have a chance to be more well equipped for those unique moments. So even if the master plan is very thoroughly vetted and considered, it would be interesting to consider if there's some mechanism built into it to allow for flexibility in the face of innovation or in the face of truly creative alternative solutions that might not fit the letter of the plan, but the intent. And I know that there are minor variance procedures and rezonings and that sort of thing that are in existence, but if a project is is being approached in a sustainable way, if there were some way to stick handle that in a more expedient and nimble fashion through all of those processes, I think that would incentivize more people to move in those directions. That's the first thing. The second thing that I wanted to touch on, I think that there's a lot of, clearly a lot of thought that's going into the transportation problem in this municipality, and that's really exciting to see. But it does highlight, I think, going way back to that question about what does sustainability mean to you, it highlights that challenge between finding a balance that minimizes compromise. Because I imagine what you will find you come up against is people's unwillingness to relinquish that freedom that their car gives them, even when there are viable alternative options available. So how do we address that? I don't have an answer for that, but some solution to the problem that is genuinely perceived to be an improved way of getting from A to B rather than just a different way and a slightly more convenient way is really the silver bullet. It's what we hope to find, and I don't know where it is out there, but it's an interesting point that is raised by your description of what's happening here, that it is something we're going to face in many situations by the population that may not come to this room and hear these sorts of things. So an uphill battle for sure.
We have time for one more question.
I do want to mention that tonight the Natural Resources Committee is studying the declaration for climate change.
Yes,
So
thank you.
it will be brought to council likely in November. So thank you for your support on
So we have time for one more question.
Should I go ahead?
I'm deciding between the two of you. Who wants to go?
So first of all, with regards to the idea of making what's the silver bullet around transportation, we were in California this summer and we visited a cousin who works for Google. And he gets on the Google bus to go to work, and he's super excited about it because he has Wi-Fi and it's really comfortable, so he can do part of his workday on the bus. So maybe that's the kind of thing that we're thinking about. And then I have a question for Mia. As all of the conversation that we've had in the room, what are some of the ways that you see that the youth can move forward to amplify the ideas that have been presented tonight?
So part of the reason why I was really quiet for most of the night, all of it really, is I am 16. This is their job to find the answers to these. I'm an activist. I take to the streets and I bring their information right to the politicians, right to their doorsteps out of pure fear for my future. So that's one way that one way that you can do it, I have been doing myself, is by having conversations with your friends, by having conversations with your family. My grandparents were very either liberal or conservative, and by having conversations with them and saying, no, you're not screwing up my future anymore, they've started to kind of see my point of view a lot more, and they've started to support me. And so by having conversations with your friends and your family, and by bringing it to your municipal, government's doorstep, it brings a different message from just we need to create a sustainable future for future generations to, hi, you're screwing up my future. Please don't. So we need to have everyone's voice and everyone's opinion and everyone's message a part of this. And so find a way to include the youth, ask them questions, get them involved. They're really great with this and Chelsea, and so join them, support them any way you can. I'm also really introverted, so I can speak.
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, okay. It's actually a comment. There are 398 communities in Quebec, or MRCs, that have adopted the climate emergency declaration. So I just wanted to make sure that we don't leave that 10 sitting there. And Yes, you know, Carol, that's very exciting news that our council is finally, is considering, you know, the climate emergency declaration, and we're all very much looking forward to, and I think participating in shaping what the response will be to that awareness and that declaration. Yeah, I had a question as well, but I can come over and ask it.
Okay, so, sorry. As Elizabeth mentioned, I'm with the Ottawa River Keepers, and I'm super empowered by the youth organizing this event. You know, we always say that youth are our future. There are now. Thank you, all you adults, for coming out and supporting these young people. And as Elizabeth mentioned, with the Ottawa River Keepers, we do have a youth water leaders program. I would love to connect with Chelsea youth, find a way that we can exchange, put on another event together, and recruit some of you guys to come participate in our programming. But I love what you guys are doing, and I'd love to find a way to support you guys.
Thank you. I have a lot of people to say thank you to. Thank you to our wonderful panelists for their time and their insight and their wonderful ideas. Merci à nos merveilleux invités pour leurs idées. Other than that, I would love to thank the Lowdown and Melanie Scott for helping us advertise and for all of their coverage of our work. Thank you to the Mill Road Community Space for being welcoming and accommodating to youth, as well as having such a great place for community events and members to gather. Merci à Rona and Chelsea pour le rabais sur l'impression des affiches. Thank you to Rona and Chelsea for helping us out with the posters. Thank you to the Fresh Mart for generously donating food, which we'll get to in a moment. I'd also like to thank the incredible adults who helped us spread the word. Merci énormément aux adultes qui nous ont supportés. Honorable mention to Lotta, one of our original members who recently moved to the Netherlands for school. She's with us in spirit tonight. We also have Lucas and Quinn, our two newest members, and though they couldn't make it tonight, they played a big role in preparing and planning all of this. Anna Anderson is one of Chelsea Youth's core members and main organizers. A lot of what you see tonight is the fruit of her labor, but she was really sick this week and couldn't make it. So on behalf of the rest of the group, I'd like to thank her for all the work and energy she's put into so many of our projects. Anna est une de nos organisateurs principales. Elle met une quantité énorme de travail dans nos projets, mais elle n'a pas pu venir ce soir car elle était malade. J'aimerais la remercier pour tout ce qu'elle fait pour le groupe et pour cet événement. I'd also like to thank Lynn and Brianne for agreeing to help out when I sent them panicked text messages 2 days ago with only half our members, Claudine here with the camera, Zoe with the PowerPoint in the back, and myself able to make it. We definitely needed the extra hands. Yeah. Merci à Wynn et Brianne d'avoir aidé autant. We name you honorary members of Chelsea. This entire event was funded out of pocket by our members with some parental donations. Tout ce que vous voyez aujourd'hui a été financé par les membres de notre groupe avec les dons familiales. We are going to be asking for donations for a couple of reasons. Une des raisons qu'on demande des dons, c'est pour qu'on puisse avoir d'autres événements comme celle-ci. We want to be able to run more events like this one, where we attempt to bring ideas and start discussions around local and global issues. We also want to be able to accommodate more new members and be able to run more independently and professionally. Nous voulons être capables d'accommoder des nouveaux membres et être plus indépendants financièrement. If you have any more questions for our guests, please come up and chat with us and them. The food is behind me on the stage. We'd love for people to stay, chat, get some snacks, and meet each other. You're all invited to stay for a little longer. Once again, thank you to everyone so much for coming out tonight. And don't forget to donate on your way out.